Hello everyone, my name is Vikram Dhamu. I represent EnLiSense and I did my doctoral studies at the UT Dallas Bioengineering department. I'm here to talk about the One Health idea, which is a sensor framework for in-site or in-situ dynamic tracking of soil health. The other two folk here, Shalini Prasad and Sriram Muthukumar, are the co-founders of EnLiSense, and Shalini Prasad is also the Department of Bioengineering head. She's the department head at the Bioengineering department, and she was instrumental. She created these sensor technologies, which I'm going to be talking about now. Questions? Do we stop for questions, or?
It's up to you how you want to do it. This is a pretty interactive group. If you encourage them, you get lots of questions.
Up to you guys.
Here we go.
Just a quick question. I mean, didn't one of your
Yes.
colleagues present about the IoT
Yes.
device, the SWET plan?
That's right. A couple of months back, Sriram Muthukumar, he presented about the EnLiSense venture, which is part of the biosensing or the health-based monitoring system, which was the, I think, the IBD.
Right.
Yeah.
So are you using the same platform for this, or?
Kinda. So that's the that's.
Okay. I'll get to that.
All right. Okay. Before getting into the technology itself, we wanted to talk about why we got into this in the first place, other than the fact that we were asked by an industrial sponsor to go ahead and create this technology. So the thought process behind this, and that's how I created the foundation of my doctoral program, was to look at the problem statement of climate change mitigation. We were looking at climate change mitigation as our single point agenda and looking at the different factors that drive it. So you can look at the industry, you can look at different transport, buildings, different factors. And these are the main three umbrella areas, which is the society as a whole, urban populations, and the food system. So what different foundations and different organizations have come to is agriculture and food systems are the drivers behind how we would get to climate change mitigation. So we concentrate on those two aspects towards large scale and long-term success in climate change mitigation. So having said that, let's look at these couple of videos I put together from the UN, the UN programs, where the first is what climate change actually drives. Climate change, how it contributes to us in a more realistic or a day-to-day scenario is it creates the way pathogens and different toxic environments to get into the environment, and how it actually drives effects like climate change drives effectively stuff like viral pathogens coming into the environment, all of that. And that was the takeaway from the FAO, which is the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. They said climate change is what drives all of these things. So what actually can be done with respect to driving climate change? So what was said is 58% more food could be produced in a more sustainable. Single takeaway from this to get into what we can then drive and how we can build our system. So that was the key takeaway from the first part. So the second dual relationship we wanted to study is the climate change and the food safety aspect. So currently, only 38% of the land on Earth can be used for food production. That is arable land, which means the other 62% or so is non-arable in its current sense. So, and there is no more land to expand into. We've really capped out there. So what that means is basically with the land we have, we need to actually optimize and efficiently do it better to get into meeting the demand over the next course of the multiple decades to come. And this math actually blows up when we look at the developing nations or different countries which are now coming up. So that means the challenge is now on for us to make smarter decisions. Coming into now what sets up the One Health framework. So we actually looked at how do we track or create a deliverable-based system to track whether One Health, the framework makes sense. So we looked at the UN SDGs, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, as our target mechanism. And what was said is, by the UN again, healthy soils act as a prerequisite to achieving these SDGs. So these, and that there are multiple factors of it, but what effectively drives that is soil can be a good mechanism if we understand it to drive better production. better nutrition, and thereby create a better environment, which then drives human life. So that's how we built this platform-based idea, where we centered it on One Health based on soil, and we looked at different factors. So what's here is actually soil nutrients, and it's getting cut off. But so the idea was to look at soil nutrients, which actually drive agriculture and food production. We look at the soil structure itself, which is then contributing to different disaster management plans, climate change plans, and so forth. And these two, which is the soil carbon, which act as the fundamental, it's like a surrogate marker. So like glucose is a good marker to track for diabetes management. For carbon, for climate change effectively and environmental health or planet health, soil carbon is a great surrogate marker to tap into. So the One Health framework can then have a dual benefit system. So what we can do is use this One Health as a prognostic or a concurrent monitoring mechanism to look at how you can look at yield, to look at food production, you can look at quality, and thereby effectively environmental and climatic health. So that's the One Health idea, where we look at dynamic tracking of these different soil health parameters and then correlate them to understand a bigger scheme of things. Getting into the technology itself. So now to actually answer your question. Fundamentally and primarily, both the UT Dallas group and EnLiSense as a group is we specialize in biosensors or based on electrochemistry. So we actually took that idea and the precision of diagnostic monitoring or biosensor monitoring and applied it to soil measurements or environmental measurement. Same idea and same technologies, but adapted it to this kind of a probe system. So that was the thought process and the goal behind this this block diagram flow. So there we have it is our initial idea of how a soil probe, which can be deployed in field, is going to be, and that's the probe head, which has multiple connector slots for monitoring different soil health parameters. So we had for this current version, we have 8 different soils slots for looking at different soil parameters, which we have sensors for. This is just an example of our initial panel where we're looking at pH, which are the main nutrients, and then we were looking at carbon, which is the organic matter and the inorganic carbon. And the center one is actually to look at the structure of soil, the physical and the chemical. So the idea was we have the chemical, we have the physical, and together we have the carbon. So that drives an effective soil health panel to understand different aspects of the environment or use case of a terrestrial system.
Sorry. So implicit in this is it seems like that the soil needs to be moist. There needs to be some moisture here, right? So which means this won't work very well if the soil is completely dry.
Absolutely. So just to get into that a little bit, I think a couple of days back, I was actually out of town, and I was talking to a person who, one of the bigger companies who are interested in, they're one of the biggest companies in ag tech. So their goal or their what they really liked is the sensor technology that we're using is actually a low moisture requirement sensor. Electrochemistry as a fundamental mechanism or a transduction mechanism requires some sort of moistness. Yes, it does. But the way we are adapting it to less than 10% soil moisture. So around 10% moisture is where our cap is. So beyond that, we're able to actually build functionality and look at a signal over noise kind of a system. Just to sort of bring it into the real world scenario, most agricultural soils cannot function below 15% or so. It needs to be beyond 15%. So that solves the problem for us. So beyond 10%, the sensor is alive, and under 15, for most part, you won't find it in agricultural soil. Right. So the aspect of the sensor is created like a pack, and it goes into the soil, and then the soil it's actually left there to measure over time. So it's a temporal monitoring system. It's a self-sufficient system in the sense it's a data logger currently in its format, where we have a memory card and it can measure over time. And so these are the raw measures, which are then we have a algorithm which can actually do conversion and look at it as usable information. All right. So
So
yes,
about this moisture, so you have a sensor for moisture.
yes, we do.
What happening if it's less than 10%? Flat line, or you have some garbage there?
It's not garbage data. The thing is, and that's what I was trying to get at, signal over noise. So if the system is not in its, like, if it's not beyond 10%, there's going to be a little bit more noise that you have to deconvolute. So it's more to do with signal over noise than anything else, as is most digital signal processing systems. All right. Coming into the actual crux of where I wanted to take this conversation is to look at identify markets that this solution or this technology can solve. The first part of it is the three-way understanding of climate change, carbon, and the soil. The first thing is different nations across the world are looking at something called carbon footprint. What that effectively means is the carbon emissions related to carbon dioxide, different greenhouse gases related to carbon, like monoxide and so forth, by whether it's entities, that is institutional organizations, or larger scale as countries. So we track carbon footprint. So this carbon footprint is a mechanism that's very well understood. So it's a good marker to understand effectively environmental, whether it's good or bad health-wise. Second comes the aspect of how soil and carbon are related. So soil is the biggest sink and source of carbon in the world. So which means that all the carbon dioxide emissions that's going to have that's taking place, eventually the soil, if it's healthy, it can be a sink for these different emissions. And also carbon is a source of life, and the soil actually triggers it. So it's both inwards and upwards. Soil is a good trigger to understand the carbon cycle. The third part is the business aspect of it. What is the need of carbon farming? Carbon farming is to understand these different effects of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as carbon, indexes or carbon neutrality, which these different companies, including Nestle, General Mills, Amazon, Microsoft, all of them are trying to get at with respect to creating a carbon positive or a carbon neutral policy within these institutions. So the way that you can get there.
I think. So you're talking about carbon and soils and farming.
Yes.
But then you listed a whole list of industrial companies
That's right.
that are trying to get carbon neutral.
Yes.
I don't understand how that's related to the carbon cycle for farmers.
Sure. So that's the sensor objective one, where we can use soil carbon as a marker for both an understanding of climate change health, but also to answer your question. Right now, let's say a company says, I'm buying X amount of carbon credits by investing in the Amazon rainforest of that many acres. A third-party institution actually validates that. It's called a carbon MRV, where it's a carbon tax credit or a carbon credit institution, which validates based on the amount of investment for that land area. But there is no way to actually create an in-ground truth mechanism.
There is no way what?
There's no in-ground truth validation to this. So
Truth.
Truth. Right. So the soil probe is a mechanism where it can be deployed, and actually you can measure the amount of carbon over the course of, let's say, a full growing season or a full year. And thereby, that's your first way of establishing, is the amount of carbon credits that you're getting truly the amount of carbon that's sequestered or accumulated over time. That's the way the first part of the validation goes, right? And there's always an environmental health aspect of it, where you understand carbon as a surrogate marker to see over the course of time, let's say a year or a decade, if you're able to sequester more carbon, meaning your planet's or your land is getting more healthier, and that way you can actually create an index for climatic health or planet health. That's the first effective idea behind it. That's the objective one. Are you okay so far? All right. And that's where I'll get into a little bit of the data aspect. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to establish taking the soil carbon sensors in a in situ. We wanted to integrate it into an in situ probe and actually put it into a field or a simulant of a field and see if we're able to get these measurements in different conditions. So actually we got this soil, which is relatively dark of nutrients from Texas A&M site. which is a grazing site. It's a cattle grazing site. And we kept the soil moisture flat to understand the sensor aspect of it and not create excess noise, because this was our first way of actually measuring and actually tabulating these different aspects of it. And I have different slides for different parameters per se. So the soil organic matter, the idea is to look at electrochemical signals in its raw sense, and then we actually build a calibration from it. That's our like a sensor know-how. And this is built to understand different soils, meaning soils are of different textures, different types. We wanted to capture as much of it as possible with respect to different, and this is part of a USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture classification based on soil textures. So that was our sensor calibration for organic matter. And then we actually tested it in a real soil. That is, it was collected in a real field. It's of a sandy type. It's a cattle grazing site. And we took it over, I think last year, yes, June. And we referenced it against an actual lab, which is the gold standard method. And that was the amount of carbon, organic matter that was present in it. And the sensor measurement over time is actually recorded in that time series, where the sensor measured 0.12 with a plus or minus 0.04. And that's where the biosensor's efficacy and accuracy comes into play, which showed that within a 20% reference measure, because the CLSI standards for most analytical instruments is if the percentage metric is under 20%, that is between two methods, it's actually considered a good correlation between these two. So we actually got it much closer than that. It was 0.12 to 0.1. And we actually showed another important metric when you're trying to benchmark a system, which is the percentage of coefficient of variance, which showed that over time, our system was always under 20% variance over the course of the 15 to 20 days total. But that's how we measured it. We used a rolling metric average for the SOM itself, and we also looked at benchmarking in terms of performance, the coefficient of variance. And that is how most of these slides are going to be presented, the same flow. Just wanted to give a brief on this flow format, and then I'll break it up into each sensor parameter. The second aspect is the inorganic carbon, where we again took the raw electrochemical response. We built different calibration or sensor know-how curves from it. And we then got into a temporal study, which was a proof of concept in our initial sense. And we looked at the rolling average over time. And this was across, while it says hours, this was actually across 570 measurement cycles, because we did something called as a hammer test, where we take measurements every so often to try and push the sensor to its limits and see where it actually stops working pretty much. That's the hammer test. And it worked over 570 measurement cycles to start with. And that's our, and the measurement was 0.0076 against 0.008. So it's pretty much on par to each other. And same thing with the coefficient of variance. We saw an increase initially, but then it actually flattened out over time when the sensor, the coating became more stable with the soil interaction. The third aspect is to look at volumetric density or bulk density. The reason this is important is most of these soil carbon markets look at something called carbon stocks. When you look at carbon stock in the soil, it is actually measured per unit area. So not only is the soil carbon sensor important, but you actually need to normalize it against that land area. So for that, you need to understand the physical aspects of soil, which is the bulk density or the soil volumetric density. And this is, again, the electrochemical spectra or the curves behind it to build our calibrations. And then we actually tested it over in the same soil site. And we saw that against a 1.4, the soil was measuring, the sensor was measuring around 1.57. It was again on par to each other. And the coefficient of variance was less than 8%. So together with these three different sensors, we can get a carbon stock measurement. And then we got into something like a real life scenario where we wanted to test it against a current standard. So we took a commercially available moisture sensor to answer your question. So we took a commercially available moisture sensor and we looked at the same soil data. We put it together, 1:1, and we saw that the commercially available soil sensor, it's like a yes or no system. It can measure a high, it can measure a low. It can't measure the dynamics of different things happening in soil. So soil is pretty crazy. So that's where we understood that it's never flat in it. soil, because think about it. If I keep a sponge here and I start loading a liquid on the top, it's going to wick through over time. It's never going to just, it's never binary. So the same physical concept, we modeled it using a commercially available probe against our developed sensor probe. Where we mimicked, adding an irrigation cycle where the 40% moisture was added. Then we actually dried it over time to see how the fall is. In this case, it was pretty much a breakdown of 1 and 0. And then when we added moisture back, it went again back up. So the benchmark that we were able to do is it actually looked at soil infiltration, meaning how it actually percolates over time. So you can see the nice, like a exponential breakdown, whether it's an increase or a decrease. You're able to see the infiltration of how moisture is going into soil, which is a very big requirement when they do. Let's say they have a 100-hectare or a 100-acre farm. You're looking at irrigation, which is very expensive. Let's take the example of California, where there's a big drought, and there's a requirement of the amount of irrigation that can take place. So you don't want to over irrigate, you don't want to under irrigate, which means you need to be in the know of how much water is actually required for that farm area. This is the way you can actually track it dynamically and in situ about how much moisture is required per farm and how is it actually affecting or not affecting the soil system. This is the second aspect of what you were asking. So the actual agricultural perspective of it. So over here, a farmer does not concern himself much about carbon incentives a lot, or the carbon neutrality, carbon positivity, or, all that comes from an institutional basis. This is more to understand from a farmer's perspective, what does he need to do or not do for their soil to actually help with yield and throughput. So the key to that is based on an agricultural or regenerative practice to understand the soil composition or the soil nutrients. So that was our second objective in terms of an A and B. So here we were trying to look at the different soil nutrients over a multi-week conjunctive measurement on the same soil in a similar kind of a study to establish and benchmark our sensor parameters. And yes.
Great question. So I'm assuming it is measuring the soil over a period of time to account for spikes in which are caused by floods or excessive rain.
Yes.
So what do you do to make sure that you're not getting your data skewed by these small temporal events that would cause a reading test not reflective of the reading over a period of time?
Sure. I think I'll come to that in about 5 slides or so, where I have some data from a real field study. All of these were similar studies. In the next part of what you're asking, we actually put the moisture sensor in a real field study, and we looked at irrigation over time. So when it irrigates, there's a temporal factor which takes it over time, and then it drops. You can see that whole, think about a circadian rhythm, but for the soil. This was more to understand the sensor's benchmark, meaning the sensor technology or the sensor chemistry is benchmarked in a real world setting. So this was the first half of the aspect, and then we came to the real world application or the deployability part of it. The first part is soil pH. The soil pH is a very useful marker to understand overall health of the soil, because if the soil is too alkaline or too acidic, there is no nutrients in the soil that can be taken by the plants, so effectively nothing grows. So what we were trying to get at is to actually measure soil pH as one of the fundamental markers of trying to understand soil nutrients. So we looked at an electrochemical measure for it, built it over understanding across different soil types. There was a sandy domain, loamy domain, clay domain, and again look at the temporal factor for it. So we saw that soil pH, the first 24 hours were our equilibration period. So the parametric assessment was after 24 hours. So 0 to 24 was our settling time or our equilibration time. And after 24, we were able to get stabilized results. And this was the measure versus reference, where we have something close to 8.98 against an 8.36. So we had pretty tight, between the two measurements, and the error rate was less than 8%, and the coefficient of variance was less than 2%. Pretty much it was flat across the measurement domain.
Okay, so you got right to a point kind of related. So your error rate is 7.4%. Okay, but you mentioned something a minute ago about, say, a farm was 100 acres.
Yes.
Well, that's a ridiculous size for a farm.
Right.
Say a farm was 8,000 acres.
Sure.
Okay? Who cares that the pH of the soil here
Mhm.
is 7% different than the soil there? The farmer doesn't care. The seed salesman don't care. The fertilizer salesman don't care.
Right.
Because a guy's got a farm and it's not 100 acres. It's a couple thousand acres.
Sure.
And he knows he's got soil like this over here. And he knows he's got soil like that over there.
No, they don't.
Yeah, they do. Okay, never mind that my question doesn't matter. In your opinion,
Yes.
my question doesn't matter.
So in the real world, so a soil farm of, let's say, 2,000 acres,
I'm sorry?
a soil farm of, let's say, 2,000 acres, like
Okay.
they have a farm of 2,000 acres and they have a soil, let's say, of different types across each other. One, within a 2,000 acre thing, the soil is not going to be variable based on different types. It's still going to be based on the same texture.
It's gonna be pretty much the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, if it's like over on this side of the hill, it may be like that. on
Exactly.
That side of the
Exactly.
But so it hadn't got anything to do with
Right.
accuracy of measurement.
Accuracy of measurement
Because
is,
all these farmers know they don't measure it as accurately as they can.
that's exactly the
They,
point.
they
So,
measure it as accurately as they need to.
just to answer that, so a farm in the US actually tests maybe once every 2 years.
Yeah,
That's when they do it.
well, because the earth only changes a little bit over a 2-year period.
Not based on, let's say, you're gonna actually actively harvest or farm it.
Well, when they're actively cultivating, sure, but
Yes.
they
But
all
that's why it's a
study
farmland.
that. The fertilizer salesman tested.
Yeah.
Going here's what you need this year.
Yeah. So the whole problem behind that is the thought process behind this is flawed, because the amount of fertilizer you apply across the world, there's a concept called over fertilization, which is
Yeah,
currently what
yeah,
is being. So the only way you understand the amount of fertilization to apply is to understand these aspects of it: pH, let's say nitrate,
Yeah.
ammonium,
Well,
all of that.
so I
So
guess
coming,
my point
let
where
me
I was
finish.
going, you
The
said-
7% that you're talking about is not 7% between that side to that. It's between a globally benchmark standard against the sensor.
Oh, I thought you were saying, well, okay, I thought you were talking, so,
Yeah.
so to me.
That's why this is the sensor
the
benchmarking
point-
flags.
To me, the point is not the accuracy of the sensor.
Right.
But the ease with which you deploy
That's right.
40 million of them.
Right. So,
Not 200,000 of them, that
Mhm.
doesn't matter.
Right.
Maybe if you deploy 40 billion, that matters.
so between a land space area, let's say the land space area is flat, like a Midwest land. The amount of, so that depends on the number of sensors that you need to deploy over a certain period of area. So that's why you have to sample it based on the land type. Let's say it's a gradient, right? Between the top to the bottom. Then there's going to be pretty much a fluctuation in what is measured here versus measured here. But let's say it's a flat land. Then the amount of probes that I need to deploy
There is no
come
flat
down.
land.
Relatively flat. When I say there's a gradient versus there's a flat plane land, I'm saying,
I mean, okay.
Yeah.
I'm just. So to me, it seems like, okay, you're talking about the accuracy of sample measurements with a sample size of a few square inches.
in a local standpoint, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that's fine,
Mhm.
because this few square inches is a lot like the few square
That's
inches
right.
over there.
That's right.
But the point of global climate change
Right.
is how do you understand what's happening over thousands of square miles?
Because within that, so there is something called as a local characterization, and
Yeah.
then there is a large scale characterization at global level. So what you do is you integrate it from the ground up. So that's why this is called as a bottom up approach, where you deploy it at that site. So let's say for a land area of X acres, you deploy Y number of probes. Then that is now one data set that is
Great.
switched
And
against.
so okay, so are these probes, these sensors, are you gonna sell them for a few cents a piece?
Mhm.
Or several dollars a piece?
Yeah.
Where are you, I mean,
So-
see, in the business, you didn't brief us on that.
Yeah.
Are these 18-cent sensors?
Right. So
Or
there's
are
a
these $14 sensors?
Fair enough. But there's a good reason why I didn't brief you on that. So we
Oh.
actually work with these. So the center technology that was developed by our company and the University of Texas at Dallas is the technology piece of it. And what we're doing right now is we're translating it to another venture who is now taking it to the market, and they're going to be the ones selling it. So the cost is effectively determined by them. That's why I don't get into the cost conversation to answer that question.
And scale, of course. But if they sell 10,000, that'll be one price. If they sell 100,000, it'll be less.
Yes.
Yeah. It's all about scale on the price, but your point is good, Chuck. I think your point is that it's gotta be reasonably priced, right?
Yeah.
Well,
And
yeah, because you're talking about global climate change, but
Yes.
now you're talking about sensor accuracy.
Right.
Hmm. And so a deeply inaccurate sensor,
Mhm.
if it's deployed, is way better
Right.
than no data whatsoever.
I agree. But what we're trying to establish is deployable sensors which are accurate. You hit the
Wearable
trifecta,
sensors.
which are accurate and precise. So that's the trifecta.
Okay, all right.
So why did it take 24 hours for the pH to settle?
pH is very dynamic. So when the soil starts interacting with our sensor chemistry, so pH has because it's the diffusion of hydrogen ions per se. Right? So because it's so dynamic, and I think you can relatively see that here, where over the course the carbon stabilizes pretty quickly because, like you mentioned, carbon it takes few months to years to decades to actually make a real dent. Right? It depends on the land use. If you actively plow it fallow and it gets to a fallow point, yes, there's going to be a difference that is noticeable. But carbon, it's more to do with understanding the levels of carbon at that point of time, whenever you're looking at it. But when you're looking at soil nutrients, it's much more active with respect to small minor changes to the soil. So soil pH, that's why it takes that initial curve of 24 hours to get to that stabilizing point, which is why when we deploy our probes, the first 24 hours across all the sensors are considered settling time. And then when we start pulling out, let's say, the data that goes to the cloud, is pretty much calculating or when you look at it from the dashboard, it's the measurement from 24 hours.
And in the world of carbon trading, there's still things that have to settle out. It's not all precise, but an example, if I have a bunch of cornfields and I say I'm going to put trees in, right? It's no longer going to be farmed. And those trees are a particular type that grow fast. I'm not going to till anymore. I'm not going to, it's going to turn into a forest. Well, that's called a voluntary carbon, project. So then I say I'm going to do that. I have to sell that offset on the open market. So I need to say, what is my carbon content in the soil today? And 5 years of growth in that forest, here's where it's at. 10 years, here's where it's at. Those measurements feed into what I get paid for the offset.
That's great. So he kind of mentioned that, but how do you, who says, okay, I've got an acre of cornfield
Yeah.
that skipped the corn.
Right.
I'm going to plant 35 trees like this.
Yeah.
who says what the carbon?
There's one of the organizations is Verra, VERRA.
Yeah.
Okay, they're a big voluntary carbon.
Certification.
They do the assessments. Okay, so there's this organization called Verra, and what you do is you say, I'm gonna plant these trees. You file a Verra application. And that application says, here's it's 100 acres and I'm planting these 3 types of trees. And I'm gonna, I need to assess my soil carbon now. And then I need to assess my soil carbon over time. And they're gonna pay me by the ton of carbon that, by the ton of, the increase in carbon in the soil.
As a function
There's
of
a
your
lot of
practice.
stuff that still has to be worked out on this. There are people who've had, Verra applications in there for 3 years and they still haven't been approved,
Because there's no way to approve it. So
What's that?
because there's no way to actually prove or approve.
Yeah, there's a lot of mistakes. Now, one thing that's easier for Verra to okay is if I say, I'm gonna take my farm and I'm gonna put solar panels on 100 acres. Because everybody knows how much of an offset that is, right? They'll compare it to a similar fossil fuel technology that produces
That much kilowatt.
and they'll say, okay, you're effectively taking 100 tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every month. And then I'll get paid based on that. So there's all kinds of different ways to do it. But like Vikram is saying, and if he's hitting on something that's very true, and that is the soil carbon market is less easy to evaluate, assess, and to pay for. So it's an enviable goal from that perspective. When you say so, Vikram, it hasn't all been worked out,
Because
And the old way of doing it was soil cores, right? They go around and they take core samples on the property, different areas, and then they do the measured carbon with those, and then they come back later.
Yeah, you have to ship it to a centralized lab,
Yeah.
which
It's
itself has
expensive.
Well, I don't think
certification.
they have to, that's just how they do it.
They have to.
Right.
Because
That-
getting this,
That's the
getting the chemistry is easier at a lab than it is out in the field.
Yes, the soil core method was an improvement. So they do it because it's a method that everybody says, okay,
Yeah.
this matters, I'll take that, as a good measure. But, it's an evolving world for sure.
Okay.
All right. Okay, moving on. The second aspect of it, post-carbon understanding, the second aspect, which is very important when you're looking at soil itself, is nitrogen. And one of the main metrics of nitrogen is nitrate in soil. So again, same thing, electrochemical data, calibration, and then we looked at the temporal studies of nitrate. We looked at the whole population, data set over time, and this was about 175 cycles or so. And we compared the reference it was about 4 against the measured parameter of 3.87, and the error against the 2 methods, 3.25. And the coefficient of variance, like you mentioned, so for nutrients, it's much more active or dynamic in nature. That's why the coefficient of variance is also higher, because it's not stable. It's actually a more active pool. All right. So post benchmarking of these soil sensors against a validation method, we got into actually putting it in field and then trying to see the same thing over time. So the same logic was seen in the soil pH, where we saw over time. So that was our initial about 1 day or so, and after that it started stabilizing, and that's where we looked at the rolling average of the pH. The pH that we measured was 8.0 or so, and the reference was 7.57, and this was the coefficient of variance for that period. And the difference from the reference was about 6%, and that was our key takeaway here. So that was actually put in UTD. We actually got a site of I think it was 10 meter plus 10 meter, and we started putting these probes there to measure different parameters. But this is an average of 3 different probes across that site. And then we looked at the inorganic carbon. The inorganic carbon in the field, it took that that period first, and then we saw the rolling average of the CSM. The measured CSM was about 0.89 against a reference of 0.92. That's the difference from the reference, and the coefficient of variance was pretty flatulent as well. So this was actually across these multiple different probes at that site, and it was averaged over time, and we measured daily. So again, this is the organic fraction of carbon, where we took the rolling average across that. And we showed that we excluded the first point alone because that was our day one. And after that, what we measured is 3.53 against 3.69. And the good thing about organic matter is different things, but you can actually calculate soil organic carbon from there, which is the effective parameter that is considered right now as the holy grail of soil health, is soil organic carbon. So we were able to calculate that as well from our soil organic matter sensor. And to answer your questions, so we actually worked with the UTD ground staff to see where they actually started watering or the irrigation cycle of it. We were able to match that across these different periods. So here we made sure that they didn't water it. So we showed that when they do not water it, it stays flatulent for most part across this domain. But when they do water it, we see the spike and we see the drop. And we did that across those multiple times. So we saw that our sensor was actually dynamically measuring what we wanted to do. All right. And that was just one site. But we've done sensor chemistry for we started 2019. And we got into field trials somewhere mid of 2022, and we are towards the end of 2023. And this is what we've done so far. So we started with the year where the probes are much more whiter in nature, when that was one of our initial deployments. And this is how it looks right now. It's actually nicely tanned and all that. But we took it across multiple different sites. We did it in a turf grass site, which is relatively normal and man-made. Then we actually went to the rainforests in Costa Rica, which is one of the most complex soils because it's made from the volcano. It's lava soil. And we measured across because it was a gradient like this, it was like a cliff, and we measured at different points there in the rainforest farm site. And then we brought it back in the winter of last year to East Texas, where the ground was actually at frosting, and we measured it over the month in a grazing site in East Texas. Then towards early this year, we set it up in the UT Dallas Eco Hub, which was for the last 10 years a compost site, which they now turned into a community garden, which means all the parameters that you're measuring there is super high, meaning the sensor was pushed to its maximum limits to be able to measure that because everything is high. And the sensor was doing really well, and it's still there in the UTD Eco Hub so far. That's our long-term longitudinal study that we're doing. This is how we started. This is our initial simulant study was. We actually made a bucket of so many gallons. We inserted different probes there, got measures over time. And this was our latest study. I mean, second latest. Right now, we're doing an active study in Missouri. But right now, this is what just finished a couple of weeks back. And we worked with the Dallas inner city growers and a person called Brad Boa, who's been doing quite some work with the Dallas inner city growers, and a place called Hatcher Farms in Dallas, which is a community garden again. And they're trying to make help restaurants and to grow local growers, pretty much help them. And that was like a greenhouse site. So that greenhouse site was done in the Texas summer, meaning it was terrible. It was 110 to 120 average. And through the 45 to 50 days, the soil was measured, and we have the data from all of them. So those were all our successful field deployments that we validated, and we're doing another one right now in the Midwest.
So, I mean, each sensor represents real cost, right? I mean, it's the real material cost that you're incurring. So what is the level of sparsity that you can get away with in terms of how close to each other or how far away they can be placed and still get accurate data?
Right.
You have an idea about that?
Yes and no, in the sense, again, coming back to the based on the land area. If it's going to be planar in the sense that there is no water body that's going to flow at one end and not at the other end, which means that relatively the land use is going to be similar. There is no extra environmental effects like water or different things. There is no gradient of like a height difference. In that case, yes, you can get away with effectively, let's say, across a full farm area of, I'd say, an acre or so. You can put 1 to 3 of them and still get away with it, depending on
So about
how
3
they
per
manage.
acre? would you say?
It depends. Again, it depends on which farm, which thing. So it's a very subjective discussion.
How did the compost one differ from the other ones?
So the compost one, it was, so if I was expecting everything in the single digits, the compost one was in the higher 20s. So it was crazily pushed up, which should not be expected in a real agricultural soil. Yes.
I have a quick question. You mentioned that depending upon the water flow and
Yes.
all that, the sensor will give different reading. But if you
No.
have a certain ideas about the slope and all that,
Yeah.
can't you use some kind of an AI type of a calculation that would
No.
interpret the data for you?
No.
And start putting more sensors?
So the sensor is the in-ground truth. So regardless of where you deploy it, in the gradient, near a waterfall, it's still going to report accurately because that's how we've been calibrating and controlled for different things. His question was more to do with, based on that land area, how many do you need to deploy, right? So to pretty much use the AI part of it, yes, that's where it eventually will go to, because it's the company that we work with, their eventual goal, and I shouldn't be speaking for them, but the idea is they use a complementary method of like a contextual database, which is an analytical or like an AI-based system, in complement to the probes, because that way they know how many probes they need to deploy per land area. So it's a complementary system.
Yes. But you are not into it. You are
Yeah,
using
I'm
outside
into the sensor
vendor.
technology. Yes.
How many different types of sensors are there?
Currently, we have, I think, 7 sensors which have been validated to do different things, including plant available nitrogen, different aspects of carbon, organic, inorganic, total carbon, bulk density, moisture, soil pH. So all of these things as our initial set. And we have more in the pipeline, which we work with the research division at UT Dallas. All right. So to conclude, the idea behind it, or where we eventually see this going, is, like we mentioned, to use complementary techniques in a manner where it can be local, as well as you can start stitching it together to a more larger data set or a more global data set, where we look at terrestrial health or One Health based on soil as a function of these different things, and we were eventually able to create like an index manner in terms of, let's say, health score, where we, it's a mass pool of data where you can now index and start thresholding. So that's the eventual goal behind where we're trying to go towards. We've done some exciting work over the last 4 years or so. We were featured in the Dallas Morning News when we validated it in DF in the downtown area where the Hatcher Farms is, and then they came to our soil, our lab, our soil lab, and we actually showed this in the Dallas Morning News. We also got into the Spectrum local news, did some work with the Dallas Innovates where they featured our work as well. But so far, it's been a good journey where we've proved the technology. Now we need to start getting into the deployment and scalability of it. So that's where we're at. Yes.
So who are the commercial entities that benefit for them, and what is their incentive to use?
That's why the 2 markets are open. So if it's a farmer, for them the information is, so if you look at right now, if you send it to a lab, you get a report. You get a report saying your soil pH is X, nitrate, so forth, and then it will actually index it saying you're over fertilizing it or no. Right? But then there's an overhead to it. There's a logistical as well as there's a financial overhead to these things. Where every so often it's a discrete measurement. But this idea is it's an on-demand monitoring where you can scale it to a field or a group of fields And the farmer has like a dashboard where he looks at, okay, that field is over fertilized, so I need to cut down on the amount of nitrate or whatever I apply there versus, and that's a farmer's perspective. But then also the institutional perspective, like Andy mentioned, about how we can actually get into more, I'd say, accurate and intelligent ways to influence or direct carbon markets.
Do you have an example of a dashboard that?
That's the, so while we developed the sensor technology, the contextual database and the dashboard was made by our partner, which is this group, the Soil Information. So that's these are the different entities which were part of creating this soil deployment probes. We validated with the Texas A&M University, which are the gold standard in terms of agricultural research. And then, so I represent Ecometric and EnLiSense. So EnLiSense is the health wearable side of things and handheld health platforms. Ecometric Services is our division of the environmental monitoring system. So that's what I represent. And UT Dallas Biomedical Nanotechnology and Micro Devices Lab, which is this lab where I did my PhD, is the folks who developed the sensor chemistry and the sensor technology. That's the yes.
So if people have to, the end user, for example, whoever is going to achieve
Yes.
when you commercialize it, they have to sign up different contract with SIF and different with you.
No. Everything points towards SIF. SIF is the end commercializing partner. So they commercialize it. Everything is to do with them.
Through them.
Through them.
Okay. So you would be their
We're the sensor partner.
You would be their subcontractor, so to say.
SIF is our customer.
And how big is that entity?
So it's all a growing entity. We all came up in this. This is a new subject matter area. Nobody's done this before. So we got into this.
Back up.
Yes.
I thought you'd just been telling us all this stuff goes off the labs.
Sorry.
Well, you've been saying there's all these samples go
That's right.
off the labs.
That's
So
right.
somebody's done this
No,
before.
they've not done it in the field.
Oh, okay, okay, I was wanting to be clear over
And I'm okay to make it clear. So-
Yeah.
so
that. Well, because are your measurements more or less in agreement with what happens when they send the soil sample out to a lab?
More in agreement, definitely.
Yeah.
But like I said, there's an overhead with respect to sampling it and taking it to the lab. Right? There's a cost aspect.
Well,
to it.
there's an overhead with having sensors throughout your farm and a way to get the data off of it. I earn my living off of that overhead. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
How
So
much
your sensors are accurate.
That's right. Since the technology is validated, that's where we are.
how much variance would be from your accurate reading versus sending to the lab to verify? Do you have
And
that?
that's the course of the full thing. What we've seen is under 10%. In the field, under 10%. In the bench, we've had it less than 5%. We've gotten to that because bench is more controlled. But even in the field, under 10% confidently.
It's not huge considering,
No, so when we started this, I was still a PhD student. So I did my literature survey on what the current benchmark is in environmental monitoring. And we scoured through different textbooks, and 40% variability is considered okay in the environmental world.
it's a 10%.
Yeah.
All right, that's all I had, guys.
Thanks.
Very good.